Welcome, everybody. I'm Elizabeth Donahue. I'm the Associate Dean here for Public Affairs, and I'm really excited to welcome Larry Steinberg to today's talk. Professor Steinberg is one of the world's leading experts on adolescence. I first met him when we worked on a Future of Children volume on juvenile justice together, and I just have a huge amount of respect for his work. The fact that I have 3 teenagers that I really would love to understand a lot more helps in today's invitation. And so I think we're going to learn a lot. Professor Steinberg will talk. He will take some questions from the audience, and then we will have a book sale and signing afterwards. So I'm not going to read his whole bio. I hope you buy his book, and then you can read the book jacket. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you all for coming out. What I'd like to do is change the way that you think about adolescence. And I think that the need for this kind of change is long overdue, and it's one of the reasons that I wrote Age of Opportunity. What I hope to do by changing the way that you think about adolescence is also change the way that you think about how we raise kids and educate them and treat them as a society. I've been studying adolescent development for nearly 40 years now, and I've been doing research on young people from all walks of life and in many different parts of the world. We just finished collecting data for a study of more than 5,000 people between the ages of 10 and 30 in 12 different countries that vary tremendously in their cultural and economic contexts. And I've chaired the Committee on the Science of Adolescence for the National Academy for a number of years. And I'm always struck by the disconnect that exists between what we know about adolescent development from a scientific point of view and what the public is told about this period of development. If you go to a bookstore and you look in the section that's aimed at parents of teenagers, what you typically would see are a lot of survival guides. And I think that this survivor's mentality is not doing us very well. I Googled the combination of the words survive and adolescence recently and came back with about 2.5 million hits. And then just out of curiosity, I Googled the combination of the words enjoy and adolescence. And I was surprised that I got back twice as many hits, about 5 million. And I thought that perhaps my take on this issue was not correct until I began looking at the specific hits that search returned. The first 5 were for the same book. And it was called How to Survive Your Child's Adolescence, How to Understand and Even Enjoy the Rocky Road to Independence. And that's really what's out there for people. If you go to Amazon, you look at the books that are aimed at parents of teenagers or even teenagers themselves, you'll see that many, many of them have the word survive or survival in the title. And I think if you look at our record in the United States, in terms of how our kids are doing, what you see is that this approach probably is not a very effective one. As I'll discuss later, in international achievement comparisons, American teenagers are typically near the bottom of the list, and yet our kids lead the world in things like obesity, binge drinking, experimentation with illegal drugs, crime, and violence, STDs, unintended pregnancies. So I think the way that we're approaching adolescence isn't working so well. And obviously, if you're a parent or an educator or somebody who works with young people, it's important to have a more accurate view of this age period. But I think that it's really important for all of us because we all have a stake in how the next generation turns out. And we all have a stake in wanting to raise young people who are competent and happy and healthy. And I think that new insights from the science of adolescence point the ways to how we might revise our view and come up with an alternative model of what this age period is. And I hope to persuade you that adolescence is not something to be survived. It's a time period when people can really thrive if we take advantage of the opportunity. So I want to start by asking you to think back to your own adolescence for a moment. And I know that when I think about mine, I have very vivid and very detailed memories of that time of life. I not only recall the people and the events and the places that were important then, but I recall them with a richness that is not characteristic of how I remember other periods of my life. And this is odd in the sense that my own adolescence was not particularly unusual or extraordinary. I mean, nothing very terrible happened to my family during that time period. Nothing very wonderful happened to my family either then. So there doesn't seem to be any reason that I should recall adolescence so much more powerfully than I recall other times in life. In fact, if I were to make a list of periods in my life where especially notable or memorable events took place, my 30s would probably be the most recollection-deserving period of development. But yet I don't recall that time period anywhere near as vividly as I recall adolescence. In fact, I don't recall things that happened to me last week nearly as vividly as I recall adolescence. And it turns out that I'm not unusual in this respect. A well-documented phenomenon in memory research is that most people recall events from adolescence better than they recall them from other periods of life. It's something that's called the reminiscence bump. And it is not limited to personal events. It turns out that people remember the books that they've read during adolescence, the movies that they've seen, the music that they've listened to, even current events that took place during that time period better than they recall books, movies, music, or current events from other points in development. Now, some people have postulated that this is because the kinds of things that happen to us during adolescence are particularly memorable. Your first love, your first job, your first beer, maybe the first time you lived away from your parents. But it turns out that this is not a very compelling explanation because people actually recall mundane events from adolescence better than they recall mundane events from other periods of time. So it's not due to the nature of the events. It seems to be due to something about the adolescent brain. It looks like the adolescent brain is extraordinarily sensitive to experience, as if the recording device is set at a different level of sensitivity. And this exquisite sensitivity to experience that's characteristic of adolescence is part of a bigger, I think, picture about the brain during this time of life, which is that adolescence is a time of exceptional brain malleability, or plasticity, as neuroscientists discuss it. And you probably are familiar with research demonstrating that the period of early life, 0 to 3, 0 to 5, is a time of tremendous brain plasticity, and that's something that's been known for quite some time. The fact that adolescence represents a second period of heightened brain sensitivity and malleability is a relatively new revelation. And in my view, it's one of the most exciting discoveries about the adolescent brain to emerge in the last 10 or 15 years. Now, the brain is always somewhat plastic. It's always capable of changing in response to experience. If this weren't the case, we wouldn't be able to learn things at older ages. Because when we learn something and we retain that learning, there has to be some underlying change in the neural structure of the brain, or else there would be no way of having retained the skill or the information. But the brain is much more plastic, and plastic in a different way during adolescence and childhood than it is during adulthood. Neuroscientists who study brain plasticity distinguish typically between two different types. On the one hand, there is developmental plasticity, which refers to the capacity of the brain to change during times when the brain is still under construction. Then there is adult plasticity, which refers to the capacity of the brain to change after it's already built. When the brain changes during periods of developmental plasticity, there are large transformations in brain circuitry. The establishment of entirely new brain circuits, the elimination of unused ones. When the brain changes during periods of adult plasticity, the changes tend to be limited to relatively minor tweaks of existing brain circuits, rather than the development of new ones or the elimination of unnecessary ones. What this means is that adolescence is the last period of human development during which the brain will ever be this plastic. And that after adolescence, although the brain can change, it can't change in these large transformative ways that it changes before adulthood. It's like the difference between remodeling your home and redecorating it. So when you remodel, you may be tearing down rooms or putting on additions or rewiring or replumbing your home. When you're redecorating, you're just changing the colors of the carpets and the curtains. And that's the difference really between developmental plasticity, which is a remodeling, and adult plasticity, which is more like redecorating. Now, when the brain is plastic, it's not plastic in all parts of the brain at the same time. Certain brain systems and regions are relatively more plastic at some points in development than at others. And a part of the brain that's particularly plastic during adolescence is the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is important for a number of different functions, including higher order cognitive abilities that psychologists typically refer to as executive function, so things like decision making and reasoning and judgment and planning. And it's also very important for self-regulation or self-control. So I want you to keep in mind that the parts of the brain that govern these capabilities are especially plastic during adolescence. And adolescence is a time of important development in executive functions and in self-regulation and self-control. That's significant because of all the traits that we would want to help people develop. Strong self-control is one of the most important. There are literally hundreds of studies that indicate that kids who have strong self-control do better in school, they have more satisfying relationships, they're less likely to develop mental health problems, they're less likely to get into trouble. This is a very well-documented finding. In contrast, poor self-control is a lifelong liability. Economists and sociologists have identified 4 rules that, if you follow, are pretty much guaranteed to have you lead at least a minimally satisfying life. Graduate from high school. Don't have a child until you're married. Don't break the law. And don't be idle. So if you don't have a job and you want one, take the first one that's offered to you. And if you have a job and you don't like it, don't quit until you have something better lined up. And individuals who follow these 4 rules almost always have a minimally decent life. And this isn't a moral judgment, it's just a statistical fact. And if you think about what goes into following these rules, having strong self-control is often part of it. Poor self-control is what leads lots of people to drop out of high school or get pregnant before they want to be pregnant, or walk off a job impulsively, or break the law. In our studies of juvenile offenders, poor self-control was one of the only reliable long-term predictors of which individuals keep committing crimes as they age into adulthood and which ones stop. So if there's a trait that we would like to cultivate in young people, if you're a parent or an educator or somebody who works with young people, self-control is probably it. Having strong self-control is also especially important during adolescence because of some of the health consequences of having poor self-control. So adolescence, generally speaking, is a very healthy time in human development. It's not a time of a great deal of illness or disease. And yet there is a huge increase on the order of 200 to 300% in morbidity and mortality between childhood and adolescence. And the causes of this increase in morbidity and mortality are behavioral in nature. They're things that kids do to themselves and to each other. And poor self-control is often a part of the risky and reckless behavior that young people engage in. So if we could do something to help strengthen self-control during adolescence, we could probably improve public health as well. Adolescence is a time of heightened risk-taking in many parts of the world. Many, many different forms of reckless behavior increase between childhood and mid to late adolescence, reach their peak during the late adolescent years, and then decline afterwards. This is true, as many of you probably know, for crime, which peaks around 17 or 18, but it's also true for a wide range of different kinds of risky and reckless activities that on the surface wouldn't seem to have much to do with each other. And this list includes things like unintended pregnancy, or self-inflicted injury, or experimentation with drugs. It even includes accidental drownings, which is a surprise, since adolescence is typically a time when people are pretty strong. And so we would expect that people who are younger than adolescents or older than adolescents would drown more often, but yet accidental drownings reach their peak at around 16 or 17 years of age. So there's reason to suspect that that is not because of problems in endurance or stamina, but because of poor decision-making about when and where to swim. Now, developmental neuroscience, focusing on adolescence, has helped explain why there is this increase in risky and reckless behavior during adolescence. One of the effects of puberty on the brain is to make the brain's reward centers more easily aroused. So we see that shortly after puberty, there is an increase in various types of sensation seeking and in the pursuit of novel and exciting activities. And we now understand that this is due primarily to the impact of sex hormones on activity in the brain involving the neurotransmitter dopamine. Dopamine plays many roles in the brain, but one of its most important is in the experience of pleasure. And so when you experience or anticipate something pleasant happening to you, you get a little dopamine squirt. And there is more dopamine activity in the brain's reward centers during adolescence than there is at any other point in human development, which is why, sad to say, that nothing will ever feel as good to you for the rest of your life as it did when you were a teenager. And that's because of the relative amount of dopaminergic activity in the brain's reward centers during adolescence compared to other periods of time. But this heightened arousal of the brain's reward centers during adolescence occurs against a backdrop of still maturing self-control, of a still maturing prefrontal cortex. And many of us have used a metaphor of having the accelerator pressed to the floor before there's a good braking system in place as a way of describing what's going on in the adolescent brain. That these brain systems that affect things like sensation seeking and novelty seeking are very, very easily aroused before our abilities to rein in impulses are fully mature. Now, I mentioned earlier that it's important for all of us to be concerned about how young people develop and to try to do what we can to see that they develop in healthy ways. I want to argue that this is even more compelling now than it's been in the past because of changes in the length of adolescence as a stage of life. Adolescence today is longer than it's ever been. And this is due to the fact that it starts earlier and it lasts longer. By some estimates, adolescence today is twice as long as it was in the 1950s and about 3 times as long as it was in the 19th century. One way to measure this is by looking at changes in the age of puberty at the front end and changes in the age at which people enter into the conventional roles of adulthood at the back end. At the front end of adolescence, those of us who study this period of life typically mark the beginning of this period of life with the hormonal changes of puberty. And what we know is that the age at which people have been going through puberty has been declining over time. We have very good records of this that date back to the mid-1800s. And the age of puberty has been declining by about 3 months per decade since then. So at the beginning of the 20th century, the average American girl went through puberty at around 14 and a half. And today it's close to 12. So it has dropped substantially in, as far as human history goes, a relatively brief period of time. There are a number of factors that have contributed to this. Probably the most important is obesity, because children who are fatter go through puberty earlier than children who are thinner, and we know that there's been an epidemic of childhood obesity in modern society for quite some time, and that has likely driven down the average age of puberty. And obesity is only one of several factors that have contributed to this. A second very important one is the increased exposure of children to endocrine disrupting chemicals, which have been shown to accelerate the onset of puberty. These chemicals are found not just in food and not even primarily in food, but in cosmetics and pesticides and plastics. And our children's exposure to them is really ubiquitous in contemporary society. So that's a second factor that has dropped the age of puberty, the exposure of kids to chemicals that accelerate the biological process. A third, and one that is relatively under-researched, is the increased exposure of young people to artificial light, especially the kind of light that's emitted from tablets and computers and smartphones. So there is some growing body of research suggesting that the degree of exposure to artificial light also affects the age of onset of puberty as well. And then finally, we know that children who are born low birth weight and prematurely are more likely to go through puberty earlier than children who were born at normal weight. And there has been an increase in the survival of low birth weight infants, and that has also brought down the average age of puberty in modern societies. The documentation is more clearly there for females than for males, but that's mainly because we have a single event, menarche, that we can measure very well in terms of its timing in women, and we don't have a comparable event in men. But in studies that have looked at this using other kinds of markers, we see that the decline in the age of puberty has occurred for boys as well as girls, and about the same degree of decline over time, about 3 to 4 months per decade. So the average American boy today goes through puberty a year and a half to 2 years earlier than his counterpart did in the 1970s. So that has been significant for men as well as for women. So adolescence starts earlier, and because sex hormones not only affect our sex drive and our appearance, but also affect the brain in many ways, one of which I've already spoken about, the brain changes associated with adolescence also occur earlier. So this arousal of the reward system, which is driven by exposure of the brain to pubertal hormones, is occurring at an earlier age as well. There's less consensus on how to define the end of adolescence. Typically, people think of adolescence as beginning in biology and ending in culture, ending when people make the transition into the society's roles of adulthood. And if we look at things like the age at which people get married, or finish their formal education, or become economically independent from their family of origin, we see that it is taking people longer to move into adult roles now than it had in previous generations. So that people who are 25 years old today are twice as likely as their parents were at that same age to be students. And they're only half as likely to be married. And they're 50% more likely to be receiving money from their parents than their parents were when they were 25 years old. So by many, many different indicators, people are remaining social adolescents longer than they had in the past. And so adolescence now we might think of as a period of time that lasts about 15 years, beginning at around 10 or so and ending at around 25. This makes it, I think, an even more crucial period than it had been in the past. Now, I've argued in the book that discoveries about the brain's malleability make it important to try to structure the environments that kids grow up in ways that take advantage of the fact that brain systems that modulate things like self-control and executive function are susceptible to environmental influence. When the brain is plastic, when the brain is malleable, it is not, of course, susceptible only to positive influences. It's also susceptible to negative ones, to toxic ones. And so the same malleability that makes adolescence an opportunity also makes it a period of tremendous vulnerability. And we can see the vulnerability of adolescence in a number of different ways. There's no period of development during which the onset of a major mental illness is more common than adolescence. Most major mental illnesses in their range of age of onset include adolescence in that range. The average age for the onset of a significant mental illness is around 14 years old. That's the average. So we know that people are particularly vulnerable to develop mental illnesses during adolescence. We can also see the vulnerability of the adolescent brain when we look at data on the impact of exposure to tobacco and alcohol and illicit drugs during adolescence relative to other periods of time. So individuals who begin using these substances when they are let's say before the age of 15, are 7 to 10 times more likely to develop a substance abuse problem or addiction than individuals who have the same degree of exposure but who don't begin use until they're 21 or so. Now, you're probably thinking, and understandably so, that this is because the kind of people who begin using these substances when they're 13 or 14 are fundamentally different from those who wait until they're 21. But we know from animal research in which animals are randomly assigned to be exposed to these substances when they're in their juvenile period, shortly after puberty, or randomly assigned to be exposed when they're fully grown adults, these studies find similar effects, that the animals who are exposed around the time of puberty or shortly after puberty are 7 times more likely to develop a substance abuse, a substance dependence than animals who are not exposed until their adulthood. Then one final indicator of the vulnerability of adolescence has to do with individuals' responsivity to stress. We know that some of the changes that take place because of pubertal hormones also influence activity in the brain's stress axis as well. And adolescents are more responsive to stress and to the and more likely to experience the harmful effects of stress than either children or adults. You know, a study was published 2013 by some epidemiologists who looked at the impact of exposure to war on life expectancy. And what they found was that growing up during wartime takes years off of your life, but it takes more years off of your life if the exposure occurred during your adolescent years than if the same exposure occurs during childhood or during adulthood. And we think that this is because the brain is much more stress responsive during adolescence than other points in time. But I don't want to linger on the ways in which the adolescent brain is vulnerable, because that is the narrative that characterizes our discussion of adolescence, that it's a time of inherent problems or difficulty. What I want to focus on is something that we don't tend to discuss a lot, which is adolescence as a period of opportunity. And it's an opportunity that I think we're squandering. And I don't think that there's a better example of that than the American high school. I mentioned before that if you look at international achievement comparisons, what you find is that American high school students typically perform at the bottom of the list of the industrialized countries of the world. And that's a headline that I'm sure you've seen many, many times. What you probably aren't familiar with is that when these same analyses are done using data on elementary school students, what the studies reveal is that American elementary school students typically perform near the top of the list. And if you look at analyses done on middle school students, what you find is that our middle school students typically fall somewhere in the center of the distribution of countries. So this notion that American kids achieve a lot less than kids from other countries is really limited to American high school students. It is not characteristic of American elementary or middle school students. If you look even within the United States, you see a similar story. As I'm sure a lot of you know, the federal government monitors the achievement of students annually using a test called NAEP, N-A-E-P. And they've been administering the NAEP examination for about 4 decades now. And they administer NAEP at 3 age levels, at around age 9, around age 13, around age 17. Elementary school, middle school, high school. And if you look back at the data over the last 40 years, what you see is that there's been some improvement in the test scores of elementary school students. It hasn't been dramatic, but it's been in a direction that's encouraging. And there's been comparable degree of improvement in the test scores of middle school students. But the test scores of high school students in America have remained absolutely flat for 40 years. And that's true not only for math and verbal abilities, but it's true in every subject area that's been tested as well. So despite all the discussion and resources that we've invested in school reform, and in high school reform in particular, we have not been able to budge the achievement of American high school students. Now, this is not due to different demographics. If you look at the income, family income of kids at different grade levels in the United States, what you see is that a much higher percentage of elementary school students come from poor families and middle school students than is the case for high school students. That the population of elementary and middle school students is more ethnically diverse than the population of high school students. And most importantly, by the time people are juniors in high school, a lot of the ones who are low achievers have dropped out. So the testing pool for these achievement tests is quite different when we test high school students than it is at younger ages. And even still, we see better performance among elementary and middle school students. If you look at variables that are conventionally discussed when we talk about school reform that might explain differences in student achievement, there are no easy answers to why our high school students perform so poorly relative to high school students in other countries or relative to our own elementary and middle school students. Teacher salaries are higher, by and large, in secondary education than in primary education. We spend more money on a per capita basis on secondary education than we do on elementary education. Student-teacher ratios are comparable at those different levels. The amount of time kids spend in school is comparable at those different levels. So when we look at the things that we often discuss, even teacher training, some of you probably saw a large study that got a lot of press last year or the year before, in which the investigators gave grades to teacher prep programs around the country. The reason this study received so much attention was that so many teacher prep programs received terrible grades. But the ones that are designed to prepare elementary school teachers received far worse grades than the ones that are designed to prepare high school teachers. So it doesn't seem to have something to do with teacher training either. So I'm not saying that these factors aren't important, I'm just saying that they don't explain why high school seems to be such a weak link in our education system. Now, I think if you look at survey data in which students are questioned about their school experiences, you begin to see some clues as to what may be going on. In those international achievement comparisons that I mentioned a couple of times now, each year the testers, the OECD, include some questionnaire items as well as the standardized achievement test that they administer to kids from the 30 or so countries that participate in this assessment. And not long ago, they asked a series of questions that included a couple of items asking kids how boring school was. And our kids placed second in the world in rating their schools as boring. For reasons I don't understand, Irish kids rate their schools as even more boring than American kids do. If you look at studies of foreign students who have come to the United States for part of their high school careers, what you see is very consistently that students from other countries say that high school in the United States is much easier and less challenging than it is in their home country. And if you look at the reverse of surveys of American students who've gone abroad for part of their high school education, what you see is the same picture, that American students say that the foreign schools are much more difficult than American schools are. In some surveys, we get a picture of American high schools that tell us just how stultifying they are for most kids. And when I give talks like this at a place like Princeton, it doesn't resonate with people in the audience because their children or they themselves went to these tremendous high schools. But this is really the exception to the rule and not the rule. Only 1 out of every 6 American high school students says that she's ever taken a single course that was difficult. 1 out of 6 ever taken one single difficult course. 70% of American high school students say that they think they would learn more if their courses were more demanding. And a very large percentage of American high school students go through the school day just trying to get through it without really paying much attention and without being very engaged in school. And they graduate because it is very easy to graduate from an American high school. So American high school is not very challenging. It's boring. And that's one of the reasons why I think American high school achievement is as poor as it is. We see the consequences of this when we look at what happens once people go to college. Now, President Obama, for many years now, has been calling for us to increase the proportion of high school students who go to college. And I think this is misguided. I think it's misguided because even though it is important for people to graduate from college, our problem in the United States is not getting people to go to college. We have one of the highest college enrollment rates in the industrialized world, but we're last in rates of college completion. So the problem in the United States is not getting kids to go in the door, it's getting them to leave with a college degree. And 1/3 of kids who enter college in the United States never get a college degree, they drop out. And the rate is even higher if you look at community colleges, where the rate of dropping out is about 50%. And the proportion of high school students who need remedial education in American colleges is extraordinary. It's like about 25% or so. And that's not just in community colleges, that includes four-year institutions as well. And it's extremely costly to provide remedial education to college students because it means that you're not spending those dollars on other things that you ought to be spending them on. And those of us who teach, as I do at public universities, know how tight money is and how we oughtn't to be spending so much on things that we should be expecting earlier levels of education to be accomplishing. Now, I think that the research on activities that stimulate prefrontal development, executive functions, and self-control suggests that these abilities are fostered by challenge and exposure to novelty. One of the reasons I think our high schools are doing such a poor job is that we are failing to develop the important non-cognitive skills that kids need to succeed in further education and in the world of work. Things like determination and perseverance and grit. And we're not fostering those skills because we're not challenging kids enough because we're afraid of having them fail. And one of the ways in which you develop something like grit is by failing every once in a while and learning that you have to work harder to succeed. And because we've made high school so easy for the majority of students, we're not taking advantage of this opportunity to help foster these abilities. And I know that a lot of kids drop out of college for financial reasons, but what studies of dropping out in post-secondary institutions show is that that's not the only reason that kids drop out of school. A lot of them drop out of school because they can't handle managing their own educational careers for the first time. And a lot of that has to do, I think, with poor self-control, poor perseverance skills, and a lack of determination. So if we did more to challenge kids when they were in high school, we might do a better job of equipping them with the non-cognitive skills that they need to succeed in advanced advanced schooling. A lot of you probably are familiar with the work of the economist Jim Heckman, who's been arguing for quite some time that our early education needs to focus on non-cognitive skills and not only academic skills. A lot of us think that, by the way, this term non-cognitive is really not what we should be calling these things, but nobody's come up with a better, with a substitute that seems to be better. But I think of them as sort of non-academic skills. What isn't often publicized is that even Heckman's own research shows that investing in this development of non-cognitive skills during adolescence has a tremendous payoff as well. So early childhood is not the only time where we should be investing in helping to build things like grit and determination and perseverance. We need to do that during adolescence as well and take advantage of the opportunity that neuroscience tells us is there. So let me now venture into a more speculative territory about adolescent plasticity and where it comes from and what we might do in response to it. The window of plasticity during adolescence, we think, is opened by the impact of puberty on the brain. So sex hormones affect basic neural processes like synaptogenesis, the development of new synapses, or synaptic pruning, the pruning of unnecessary ones. This is very well documented that sex hormones affect these kinds of processes. So there's reason to think that one of the reasons the brain becomes more malleable during adolescence is because of puberty. We know a lot less about what closes the window. We know that it closes. We know that the brain becomes much less plastic after adolescence, but we don't know why. And in Age of Opportunity, I suggest, and it is a suggestion, that the decline in plasticity at the end of adolescence may be experience dependent. I say this because there's some animal research that suggests that exposure to novelty not only affects the brain at the time of the exposure, but it also primes the brain for subsequent learning. It makes the brain more capable of change in response to future experience. So this suggests that during this period of brain plasticity, we may be able to prolong the period by keeping individuals exposed to novelty and challenge for a somewhat longer period of time. Now, if this is the case, it raises some really interesting questions about how we should be thinking about young adulthood and the transition of adolescence into adult roles. Because for most people, the transition from adolescence into adulthood is accompanied by a tremendous reduction in novelty. This is true for the transition into entry-level jobs, where for most people, they are doing the same things over and over again. And I hate to say it, but it's also true for marriage, where reports are very clear that there is a tremendous drop in marital satisfaction during the first year of marriage, and that some of this drop is due to a reduction in novelty. So as a transition from adolescence to adulthood, it is a transition that is marked by experiences that may actually serve to reduce brain plasticity during this time period. So that I think that a lot of the hand-wringing that is done in public media about how long it's taking young people to become adults may be misguided. Because it may be the case that delaying the transition into adulthood is valuable if the years of the delay are spent in novel and challenging experiences and activities. I published an op-ed in the New York Times making this argument, and I made a lot of friends who are in their early and mid-20s. So just to wrap up, and then we'll have some time for some questions. There are some takeaways that I hope I can leave you with. The first is that I think it's important to get the message out that adolescence is a second period during which the brain may be especially sensitive to experience. a second period of heightened brain plasticity. We hear a lot about the need for higher quality early childhood education, universal preschool, and so forth. And I'm not arguing against that. But I think we need to remember that early intervention is not an inoculation. It's an investment. And we can't just give kids high quality preschool and cross our fingers and hope for the best. We need to invest in children throughout education, but I think especially during the adolescent years. And I'm involved as an investigator in a project that we're doing in Chicago now, looking at the impact of a non-cognitive intervention on the behavior and academic achievement of very at-risk young African-American men who are in middle school or high school years, to see if, in fact, we can do something to help foster things like perseverance and determination and grit, and in so doing academic achievement in this population. So the first take home is it's not all about early childhood. The second is that we have got to make our high schools more demanding and more challenging. Far too many American high school students tell us that school is boring and uninteresting, and that they themselves think that they would learn more if they were asked to do more, if they were pushed harder. And I think we need to do that. A third, and a point that I make in the book at great length, is that there are things that we know that parents can do to help foster these capabilities that are so important. And I describe a style of parenting that we call authoritative parenting, which is a combination of being firm but being warm, which has been shown to facilitate the development of things like determination and perseverance and responsibility. So we need to do a better job of educating parents at what they can be doing during adolescence. And I think that if we keep sending parents the message, as we send them, that adolescence is just something to survive, then it's unlikely that they're going to invest what they need to invest in the period. I like to think of it as sort of that we've turned adolescence into the root canal of parenting, in which people go into the experience thinking, if I can only just get through this, I'll be happy. And if we continually send this message to parents, that the best you can do is to get through it, that I don't think that they're going to invest the time and the resources that need to be invested in this age period. So a study that was released last week or so that got a lot of attention in the press that looked at the impact of time mothers spend with children on children's development. There are reasons to question some of the findings in this report, but one of the findings that got a lot of attention, which I think is fascinating, is that the correlation between parental time with children and children's healthy development was stronger during adolescence than during early childhood. And one question that a reporter raised on this, Jen Senior, who wrote about this in New York Magazine, was how unlikely it is that we would give people parental leave to spend time with their teenage children. But perhaps we should think about ways of permitting and encouraging parents to spend more time with their kids during adolescence instead of trying to avoid it and figure out how they can survive more. And then finally, I just think that we need to change the way that we think about adolescence, that we have to stop thinking about it as a time when the best that we can do as young people is just get through it and just survive. And instead, thinking about it as a time when people can really thrive if we take advantage of the opportunity that the adolescent brain provides us. So thank you for coming, and I'm happy to answer any and all questions about this topic. Thank you.
Thank you for the topic, very interesting. I have a question. So you were saying that adolescence lasts from the age of 10 until past the age of 20?
Yes.
Yes. So, and you emphasize a lot on high school education, but should we discuss whether we could do anything with college education as well?
Yeah.
There has been a lot of discussion about liberal arts education and
Right.
how much it cannot do to
Right.
make use of all the potential?
Right. I think that's a great question. I think that if in fact the brain remains plastic through the early 20s, and if we look at studies of brain development, what we see is that brain development is not complete by age 18 by, in any regard, and that there is considerable brain development into the 22, 23, 24 year range. And if that brain development is not only driven by biological maturation, but also influenced by experience, then that means that the college years, as you point out in your question, are also an important time to stimulate higher order skills, both cognitive and non-cognitive skills. And I think it's important to ask whether we are taking advantage of that in our undergraduate institutions. Now, I'm certain that we are taking advantage of that in institutions like Princeton. But I worry a great deal about the trend in less prestigious institutions, less selective institutions, toward transforming college into vocational school for people in their 20s. And I'm very skeptical of the notion that we can make college education an online experience for individuals and still reap the same benefits that we can through face-to-face interaction between instructors and students. So I do think we should be thinking more about what it is that stimulates brain development during the young adult years and how colleges and universities can take advantage of that. I don't think we know a lot about this. One huge deficiency in the brain development literature is that most of the studies that look at differences between the adolescent brain and the adult brain use as the comparison group anybody who's older than 18. And they lump together people who are 19 and people who are 30. So we have not, the neuroscience community is only now beginning to do studies that break up this decade of life, the decade of the 20s, into finer and more discrete periods so that we can ask, how is brain development during the early 20s different from brain development during the mid-20s or during the late 20s? I'm involved in a study now funded by the MacArthur Foundation that's trying to do just this. And I can say that our preliminary results suggest that the brains of individuals in their early 20s in many respects behave more like the brains of teenagers than like the brains of people in their mid to late 20s, at least in the tests to which we've been exposing them. So I do think it's a really important question, and I don't think we know anything about it at all. Yes?
Do you think computers and video games are more attractive to teenagers because of their novelty, and there seems to be a perseverance that some of these kids have with the video games that they don't have with their academic, but can these be utilized better?
Yeah, so I do think that that one of the attractions of these video games is that it does take advantage of this natural inclination to seek exciting and novel experiences. And it's interesting that the video game industry has figured this out, but our educational institutions have lagged far behind. There is a movement, I'm sure you're aware of, that involves the gamification of activities that aren't necessarily thought of as games. And so there are attempts to develop software and classroom-based exercises that look more like video games in some respects than conventional academic instruction. We don't know, but I think that you've very correctly pointed out that an age group that we typically characterize as lacking persistence can often be glued to these activities for hours and hours on end. But I think that if you look at the activities, that you probably see that there's an awful lot of stimulation of the brain's reward centers built into them. And I don't want to necessarily liken these games to other kinds of addiction, but there have been people who've argued that some of the same brain circuitry that's activated by exposure to recreational drugs is also activated by some of these video games. So I do think that there are things to be learned about education for more important purposes, perhaps, than what are served by video games, by looking at how kids interact with them. Yes?
I'm wondering if you could say something about medication. So I'm thinking, as you're speaking, you're talking about how, the self-regulation is still developing. And so there are kids who have a lot of impulse control issues, and medication seems to be this very go-to place to regulate that.
Right.
And so what happens then if kids aren't internally developing that sense of regulation, but it's this external medication that is kind of, for that time period, controlling it? Does that become like a lifelong kind of crutch?
Yeah, I don't think we know the answer to that. We do know that if you look at populations of kids who are diagnosed with ADHD, that they do show more stunted development of prefrontal regions during the adolescent time period than kids without such a diagnosis. And so we are, I think, fairly confident that some of the attentional problems that are manifested by these children can be seen in structural differences between the brain systems that govern self-regulation in them and in MAC controls. What we don't know is whether the medication that's prescribed can have lasting positive effects on these brain systems that may persist even after the medication is discontinued, or whether, as you ask in your question, whether this externally imposed self-regulation through the medicine becomes kind of a crutch that impairs the normal development of self-regulation. We don't know the answer to that. Yeah, I did. At first I thought I misheard you, but it reminded me of something I wanted to say, which has to do with the meditation rather than medication. And one of the activities that does look promising for the development of these self-regulation systems is meditation. That is something that more and more schools, typically charter schools and private schools, are trying to incorporate into their daily activity for kids, because it does seem to improve things like self-control. Yes, you had your hand up.
One of the things I wonder is whether there is a channel or some kind of process that is alive now that channels the kinds of discoveries that you and other researchers are making into the people who are making up teacher training and teacher training tests, because I remember taking my qualifying exam to go into education as a junior at Cornell, and then at the end of my 2 years doing that, on the test I felt it was full of total drivel, which was based on the drivel I was being taught in the textbooks, and I qualified, my score at the beginning was I was in the 3rd percentile. 97% of the people in the world would be a better teacher than I would be. And at the end, I tripled my score. I had 9. And I became a master teacher and a person who started educational alternative schools and went on and got my doctorate in education. I was a lifelong educator in the public schools and in the private. I became a master teacher. It was nothing to do with anything I learned in the courses. And I wondered if we've gotten that any better yet.
Well, as a fellow Cornellian, I'm sad to hear of your experience there.
Practice teaching was good, but the rest was not.
I think what we're seeing now is an explosion of interest in this topic in the education community, and I mean explosion in both the best and worst sense of that. So there's a lot of bogus programming that is supposed to help teachers be more brain-oriented and brain-sensitive in their classroom approach, in which we really know very little about what kinds of impact different teaching approaches or pedagogy have on brain development during during this time period, but I think there are some promising education interventions that are focusing on things like self-regulation and perseverance. If you look at some of the private schools that have been getting a lot of attention, like KIPP, for example, as a network of private schools, one of their tenets is to focus on these non-cognitive skills and not just on academic instruction. I think you raise a parallel point, though, about who's going into teaching, which is a tremendous concern here. I don't, given the salary structure of that part of the labor force, it's not clear how we can change that quickly. As you may know, Finland turned its education performance around by transforming teaching into a high prestige occupation and accepting much better students into its education programs. Now, of course, Finland is a place where you have a very good safety net, and so you can afford to take a job that's maybe lower paying than you might otherwise want, because a lot of other expenses are taken care of, and where the gap between what teachers make and what other professions make is not as large as it is here.
I asked group after group of people to raise their hand if they would tell their child that they should take up teaching. I have not yet seen one hand.
Sure, right. And even if you look at experiments like Teach for America, what you find is that it's kind of a training ground for Goldman Sachs or other investment firms, because because the kids are going to TFA, typically do it for a couple of years and then they leave. And moreover, the evaluations suggest that the students who are educated by TFA teachers don't do any better than the students who are educated by conventionally trained teachers. So yeah, I mean, it's been very, very difficult. But I think that it's a vicious cycle, right? I mean, it's not just salary. If in fact the training that they're getting is drivel, as you describe it, then there are all kinds of reasons to want to avoid going into that
I don't know
that
if you're
field.
teaching them now because I haven't been there. I mean, that was a long time ago.
Not much better.
I only pray it's better.
No, I don't think it's much better, and I don't think that the population of people going into teaching anywhere reflects our more able undergraduates. Yes.
Can you comment on moral and ethical development and what might be a good idea, so we don't have German pilots flying at the mountains and things?
Well, I'm not sure that that was a moral deficiency.
I think it was.
Well, it looked
Well,
like.
I think that there's some mental illness involved, but there's also that my life was worth more and my prestige was worth more than anything, and I think that's a moral issue.
Sure. I think that some of the activities that are likely to facilitate prefrontal development are those that could involve moral education and the incorporation of more philosophy and critical thinking and discussion into our classes. Because I don't think you can provide moral education through the kinds of rote memorization activities that predominate in high school. So I do think that an added benefit of taking a different approach to secondary education, which emphasizes challenge and critical thinking rather than the simple memorization of facts, is that it would leave room in the curriculum for things like moral education and what I would think of as higher order discussions. Of course, well, one of the problems that we have is that some less sophisticated thinkers, I think, have difficulty separating the content from the process. And they worry that if we start to engage in moral education in schools, that there's going to be content there that dictates certain moralities that people may or may not endorse, when to me moral education is about the exchange of views and a more thoughtful discussion of issues about important decisions and dilemmas that we face. Okay, well, thank you all. Thanks.